Well, this here is Brennan Martin. He's the author of the book Teenie. This is a book that he wrote about his grandmother, Christine Jarrett, who was put her niche in wrestling history as a female wrestling promoter. And Brennan, it's good to meet you, and tell us a little bit about your book.
Thanks, Tim. It's based on this true story of the life of Christine Jarrett. She was a single mom, took a job selling tickets to the matches in Nashville. It was a second job for her in 1946. And before it was all said and done, she ended up being the most successful female promoter in the history of wrestling. Her son, Jerry Jarrett, is of course very well known, and her grandson, Jeff Jarrett, is of course just recently into the WWE Hall of Fame.
As I understand now, so Jeff is your uncle? Jerry is your uncle and Jeff is your first cousin?
Yeah, that's right. So Teenie had two kids, Jerry and my mother, Carolyn. And so Jeff's my first cousin, and I was never in the business. My mother was not a fan of wrestling and kept me out of it. But now I've written this book, and so this is my little venture into the wrestling business.
Yeah, and how long was your grandmother, how long did she promote shows in the Memphis area?
Well, she was in the business total for 52 years, from 46 until 1998. She started being a town manager in 1960 in Columbia, Tennessee, and she went on to open up Louisville, Evansville, Lexington, which she ran, well, two of those every week, at Lexington once a month from 1970 onward. And then when Vince McMahon ran all the territories out of business and she was no longer a promoter, she went back to selling tickets for a little small promotion that ran in Nashville in the building where she had previously operated. But she loved the business so much that she couldn't imagine not being in it. So even when she wasn't a promoter anymore, she went back to her ticket booth.
Wow. Yeah, and I understand now your grandmother, being a woman in a man's business, I understand that she had some very strict rules that she insisted behaviorally that all of her wrestlers that she employs. Give us a little example of some of those rules that your grandmother had.
Yeah, she was. She ran a tight ship. So she had, there were a few rules that she expected all the wrestlers to follow. One was no foul language. She very much believed that wrestling should be a wholesome entertainment experience, so that she thought that if there was a lot of foul language in the ring and that their kids were hearing, that parents wouldn't bring their kids around. She also insisted that wrestlers be on time. Brickhouse Brown was here last year and was telling me a story about he was about 10 minutes late one day, and she wouldn't let him on the card, sent him home, which was not something that he appreciated very much. But that was her rule. You get there an hour before the first bell, regardless of where you were on the card. No arena rats. She didn't like the wrestlers hanging out with the little girls by the back door. And of course, the biggest rule was never ever break kayfabe. She was a big believer that once kayfabe was broken, that people would stop coming. I'm not sure she was right about that, but that's what she thought.
Well, at that time, I think she was. Yeah, maybe not today, but back then.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. She didn't smarten anybody up. She never smarted me up. Same with Jerry. I had a conversation with my cousin Jeff, where he was saying that Jerry never said one word. You just had to figure it out, and that's just the way they ran it.
Great. Well, I know it's a great read. I read that about a year or two ago when I first met you. And you have any other future projects, any future plans with this, or what do you have? What looks ahead for you?
Yeah. So people keep asking me that, and this was such a labor of love. I'm not a historian. I don't really fancy myself a professional writer, but this was a story that I wanted to get out there. So I'm not sure I'm going to take on anybody else's story, but I've thought about trying to figure out, see if I can figure out how to write a screenplay and maybe turn this into something else.
Absolutely. I think, her story would look good on the big silver screen there. I think it's a fascinating story.
That's right. Exactly. Single mom, second job, woman in a man's world, and wrestling is, of course, always an interesting subject matter for film.
Absolutely. All right, Brennan. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir, and I look forward to seeing you at future gatherings. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you and share wrestling history.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, take care. All right, well, I'm here with wrestling historian Jason Presley. Jason, it's always good to see you. As always, I know I've seen you at a few of these gatherings here, and this is your book here about the history of wrestling in Alabama back in the 1930s. And so tell us a little bit about your book and a little bit about the work that you do in the wrestling business as a historian.
Well, I started asking a lot of questions trying to figure out where wrestling came from in Alabama. Everybody knows Southeastern and Gulf Coast and Nick Gulas and Roy Welch, but no one could tell me anything before that. So I was trying to figure out, well, what happened before Nick Gulas and Roy Welch were running the state? And so I had to look it up myself because nobody really had the answers. This is sort of the first 5 years of basically a former middleweight wrestling champion named Chris Jordan moved to Alabama in 1931, and he started promoting, and using all his contacts, he basically formed the first real territory in Alabama, running about over a dozen cities on a weekly basis. And Chris Jordan was Nick Gulas' mentor. Nick Gulas got into wrestling through Chris Jordan when he was working in Birmingham. And so this is a complete history from 31 to 35 with all the results of every card I could find, along with a lot of photos and ads and little interesting bits of context for what was going on in the country and in the state at the time.
So who were some of the stars in Alabama back in this era?
Back in the 1930s, it was mostly light heavyweights and middleweights. So, and because Chris Jordan was a middleweight, that was sort of the group of people he knew. So the main stars through the early years were Joe Gunther, Freddie Knickel, and the two of them were both middleweights and light heavyweights, and they were sort of the feud for the entire 10 years of 31 to 40. Anytime that they got together, they were fast, they were technical, they were exciting, and they would sell out the Birmingham Auditorium just when those two were named that they were going to be on the card. Just like if Jim Londas was coming to defend the World Heavyweight Champion, he would sell out the building, but then so would the middleweights. And there was a few others. A guy he went by the name of Lon Chaney. He was one of the big villains at the time. His name was Carl Chaney. He was from Indiana, but it was about that time that Lon Chaney Sr. was big in the movies, and so there was a big name, so it was an easy jump to make. Joe Dillman was another one that sort of he was a sort of a journeyman, sort of a villain you love to hate. He was good, he was brash, he was arrogant, but everyone came to see him. And those were sort of the four that really anchored Alabama in the 30s.
I know back in those times, the Great Depression, that hit the South pretty hard, all the farmers down there and so forth. So I guess through it all, wrestling survived and provided a lot of entertainment when they were down and out.
Oh, absolutely. Wrestling was something so they could forget about their problems of the day. And that's one of the things that sort of surprised me in the 30s. The 30s is really when wrestling took hold in a big way across the entire country while everyone's broke and has no money. And that's sort of reflected if you see the ads and see the ticket prices start to trail down from $2 ringside down to $1 ringside down to 40 cents, and kids and women get in free just to keep the shows going and to give people something to do. And it was just really astonishing that Chris Jordan was able to build a territory in the worst possible economic circumstances.
Yeah, I understand they used to do bartering gates at that time, where if you didn't have money, if you just bring us some eggs from your chicken coop or bring us some kind of food or something like that, sometimes they would do bartering.
They would do that, and they ran a lot of charity cards too.
Right.
Every Christmas, Chris Jordan would usually give away somewhere like a dozen turkeys to 12 lucky families that came to the matches, and he would do that every year.
So do you have any other projects that you're working on now? Anything you're working on for the future?
Well, I'm working on the second book to follow this up, which will be 36 to 40, and then I'm going to follow that with hopefully a single volume for the 40s, because the war and everything, it'll be a shorter volume. And then I'm just sort of getting back to the 30s. I really got invested in a lot of the wrestlers and personalities from this book, and I've sort of followed them around the country as they've gone to other cities. And you sort of get an idea of, as you go through here, who traveled together, especially when they left the territory and went somewhere else. 2 or 3 guys would go together, or someone would go off to Oklahoma and then they'd bring 4 guys back with them, and sort of refreshes the roster in the area. And so I'm just sort of going to be following some of the same guys around through Tennessee and Michigan and Ohio and Indiana and just wherever else they worked. Because there's a lot of big names that made a lot of impact 20 years later got their start in the 30s.
Right. I see that one says volume 3. Now, do your first 2 volumes also covers the 1930s?
Well, actually what Scott was trying to do is come up with some sort of cohesive theme for the series of books that he's doing. There's the Madison Square Garden book was the first one, and then he had the second book was the history of Nashville, and this is sort of the third book in that series.
I see, okay.
So he's got a bunch more on the back of this. He's got a coming attractions of about 15 books that are due out this year.
Oh, wow.
And there are several more of these type books coming for different cities around the country.
So if anybody is interested, where can they get a copy of that book?
Well, this is the last copy we have here at the Cauliflower Alley, so I'll be glad to sell you this one. But coming Saturday, Scott will be listing his 4 newest books on crowbarpress.com, and all the rest of the books he has, over 30 different books that he's written, will all be available on crowbarpress.com.
Crowbarpress.com, yeah. Great site for a lot of wrestling history books and all that. Right. Well, Jason, thank you very much for your time, sir. I look forward to seeing you some more over the coming days here. Take care. All right, I'm here with Steve Verrier, author of a few books here about Gene Kiniski and professional wrestling in the Pacific Northwest. And Steven, tell us a little bit about your books and some of your works.
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, this book was a great pleasure to write, Gene Kiniski, Canadian wrestling legend. As I researched this previous book on the history of Northwest wrestling, I just came to realize what more Gene Kiniski was than what I'd seen on TV. This chronicles his whole life from 1928 to 2010. He was a depression survivor, came from an amazing family, had a very good amateur wrestling background and professional football career. We know Kiniski as a wrestler, but I hope in this book he comes across to you as a great deal more, because he was. If you're interested in history, this covers the history of Northwest wrestling from its inception in 1883 until 2017 when the book was published. I hope you'll enjoy reading these. Look them up on Amazon and get in touch if you have any comments to make.
Anywhere else besides the Amazon that they're available?
Well, you can go to McFarlandBooks.com. It's hard to say what bookstore or where you are may have it, but certainly can be ordered through any of the major bookstores as well.
Do you have any current projects that you're working on, any future books?
Well, I'm working on something right now not having to do with wrestling. I apologize for that if I have to, but I'm looking at doing a couple of more biographies in the near future as well.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's always good to see you, and good luck. Okay, I'm here with Dan Murphy, the author of a few wonderful wrestling books on the wrestling history. The Sisterhood of the Squared Circle, a very unique book about the history of women's wrestling. Here you go. Another one that you've got with you right now is called Body Slams in Buffalo, about the history of professional wrestling in Buffalo, New York. There you go. And I know you've authored some other books. I believe I've got do I have a book with your name on it about Mad Dog Vachon?
No, the Mad Dog Vachon is actually my co-author, Pat LaPrade. He and I wrote Sister of the Squared Circle together, so he's done the book with Mad Dog Vachon, and he did a book on the history of wrestling in Montreal, Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs. But my other books outside of wrestling, I've done some regional history books about Western New York, where I live. So I've done some history and some wrestling history and a little bit of everything.
Right. So how long have you been working as a wrestling author?
Well, I write for Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, so I've got a copy of that here too. And I've been with PWI for 22 years now. So with Pro Wrestling Illustrated, doing all of the interviews, doing the PWI 500, the ranking of the top 500 guys, the women's 100, I do all of that. And so that got me involved in wrestling. You know, I was a fan all my life. Right out of college, I got the opportunity with PWI. I'm still there. And then it's allowed me to meet historians such as yourself and others here at Cauliflower Alley, and that got me into writing the books. So it's been a good run so far.
Yeah, I know. When I was growing up, actually up into my into my adult life, before the internet, when it came to, and back in the days when wrestling was more territorial and regional stuff, the only way a real wrestling fan could find out what was going on in the wrestling business throughout the country was through the national wrestling magazines, and among the few, and the one at the top was always Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So I owe a lot of gratitude to that publication for letting me know what was going on out there. back before the internet.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I hear that all the time. It was the same with me. You knew your local territory. For me, it was the WWF. I was in Western New York, but it was also I was 10 for the first WrestleMania. Like I was the perfect Hulkamaniac age for that time. So that's what I knew. But then you'd read the magazine, get the magazine, and you'd be reading about the Von Erichs. You'd be reading about what was going on in the Pacific Northwest or the World Wrestling Council in Puerto Rico and Japan. And it really kind of opened your eyes to, there's more other than just what's here in the WWF. And the magazines really kind of were the thing that smartened up two generations of fans to how wide and diverse pro wrestling is. And we still keep it alive. PWI is the last wrestling magazine on the newsstands. Our first issues are actually The Wrestler and Inside Wrestling. PWI came out in '79, so we're coming up on the 40th anniversary this year. But we had other magazines that were part of that branch, that umbrella. PWI is the last one standing, so we're trying to carry on that legacy and keep it for the current generation of young fans.
I know the one issue that I always made sure that I bought every year was when they would do their yearly polls, and they would issue awards out for the Wrestler of the Year and the Tag Team of the Year and the Most Hated Wrestler of the Year and the Match of the Year and all that. That was always, you got to get that issue every year.
Absolutely. The Achievement Awards is a big one. The PWI 500, the one I have with me is the Women's 100. But yeah, the Achievement Awards for me, I couldn't celebrate the end of a year and look in the new year until I had that PWI, because it had the match of the year, and then all the runners up, and it had the unofficial awards that the fans would come up with and things like that. So it was a great way, and I've still got all mine saved because you can just look back on what that year of wrestling was, a tangible, physical thing of the top matches and top memories, and that was an amazing thing to have.
Well, tell us a little bit about your Sisterhood of the Squared Circle book.
It is a complete history right here of women's professional wrestling from the 1890s or so all the way up until today. We really look at the very beginning from the carnival circuit through the Mildred Burke era, the fabulous Moolah. We talk a lot about Moolah's legacy, up until what we have, even like the bra and panty. That's when that was popular. We talk a little bit about the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, about apartment wrestling, which was something that we did in the magazines. And then what it's become with what All Japan Women did and what happened in Japan, Shimmer in the U.S., and now the women's evolution in WWE. And in fact, we end the book on looking at what Ronda Rousey, who hadn't even become a pro wrestler yet, how that she could be the next step in pro wrestling and could potentially be a pay-per-view headliner. And here we are, she headlines WrestleMania. So yeah, it's the right time. It all came together for us.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you very much for your time, sir, and it's always good to see you at these events. And we've struck up a friendship here, and your partner Pat, he and I met up in Iowa last year, and so I haven't met the two of you together yet, but in different parts of the country. But anyway, thank you very much for your time, and good luck to you. And if anybody wants a copy of your book, you want to give a plug where they can get it?
You can always get it on Amazon or ecwpress.com. You can find it at fine booksellers near you. If they don't carry it, demand that they do, and or find me on Facebook. You can message me directly on Facebook, and I'll get in touch with you. We'll make it work.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan. Appreciate it. All right. I am here with John Cosper, the author of many great books on wrestling history. And John, it's good to see you. And tell us a little bit about some of your current projects and future projects that you got going on.
Well, the latest release I've got is one called The Original Black Panther. It's the story of Jim Mitchell. Mitchell was the first real African-American superstar in pro wrestling, started back in the late 20s. He was trained by Jack Reynolds. He was out of Louisville, Kentucky, and ultimately went on to travel all over the U.S. He traveled to Canada, Australia, and Europe. Had a huge feud in the late 40s with Gorgeous George, and worked a lot of matches with Antonio Rocca, Gene Stanley, and a lot of the other big stars of the day. I came across him when I was working on my first book about Louisville wrestling, Bluegrass Brawlers, and what I kind of come to find out about him was, there was a little bit known about him. There were a few historians who remembered him, but the general consensus was that until Bobo Brazil came along, there were no African American wrestlers wrestling against whites. That there was a color barrier across the country, And really, the Jim Mitchell stories dispelled that completely. He wasn't the only guy around. There was a gentleman, Jack Claiborne, and then Celie Samara. But as these guys were coming up, there were no other African Americans anywhere nearby for them to wrestle. So, he broke in wrestling against white wrestlers in Indiana, and then the early 1930s, working for Jimmy McLemore. Moved on to the Ohio territory. He worked in New York and Boston. Worked in the Pacific Northwest, worked in California. Really is a forgotten pioneer of the business, and it's really been a lot of fun digging through the history and and getting to know who this guy was and being able to share that story.
Right, and he put in a long, successful career in the business.
Really did. I mean, we're talking over 30 years if you include the time that he worked part-time and worked as a referee for his buddy Martino Angelo up in Toledo.
Wow. And what's your bluegrass book about?
Bluegrass Brawlers is the story of professional wrestling in Louisville. That was my first book. It goes all the way back to 1880 and all the way up through 2014 when the book was released. But just kind of a general history of Louisville, Kentucky, and the wrestling, community, and the history of the matches going back to the circus days, and how Ed Strangle Lewis got his name when he no-showed an event in Louisville and showed up 2 weeks later and had to change the name he was billed under. And it tells the story of the Allen Athletic Club, which I went into greater detail in another book called Louisville's Greatest Show. They ran from 1935 to 1957 during the era of Wild Bill Longson, Orville Brown, Mildred Burke, Gorgeous George and Luthez, Black Panther Jim Mitchell as well. And then Bluegrass Brawlers also continues on into Memphis Wrestling era and the OVW era as well.
And what about your book on Lord Carlton? Tell us a little bit about him.
That was a fun one to do. Lord Leslie Carlton's kind of a forgotten man, and I partnered up with his daughter to tell his story. It was kind of basically a similar origin story to Gorgeous George, in that he had gone as far as he could, just wearing the black trunks and just being another, former sailor as Tug Carlson in the ring. And then he comes across Lord Lansdowne, who was the first, a farm boy from Ohio, created this, sophisticated aristocrat character. And Gorgeous George kind of stole the act and took it one way, and Lord Carlton took it another way. And it made himself one of the biggest heels in the 1950s.
Wow. And I believe your most recent book was one you helped co-author with Dr. D. David Schultz, Don't Call Me Fake.
Not the most recent, but yeah, a year ago we did put out his autobiography, and everybody, of course, knows Dr. D from the slap heard around the world with John Stossel, but he had a great career working for Stampede, working for AWA, working in Memphis, and even had a really, really great run even after he was fired from WWE. But the rest of his working career, he ended up becoming a bounty hunter, and the book's kind of split. The first half of the book is his wrestling stories. Second half is his bounty hunting stories, and most people agree when they read the book. I bought it for the wrestling stories, but the bounty hunting stories were the best part.
Yeah. But he's off right now. He's usually sitting right there meeting the fans, but we will meet up with him a little bit later on. I'm due to meet and have a nice little interview with him tomorrow, so looking forward to that. But so, do you have any projects that you're working on now? What can we see from John Cosper in the near future?
Very soon I'll be releasing a book with Hurricane J.J. McGuire. Not a name a lot of folks know, but he's the Bernie Taupin to Jimmy Hart's Elton John. They were the music behind Sexy Boy for Shawn Michaels. They wrote Cool, Cocky, and Bad for the Honky Tonk Man. They wrote over 114 different wrestling themes for WWF and WWE. He was the musical, the composition, and the instrumental guy behind Hulk Hogan's Wrestling Boot Band. He was also a member of the Gentrys with Jimmy Hart going back into the 70s. He had a really interesting career working in Hollywood, working for a recording studio, and has stories about folks like Gene Simmons and Farrah Fawcett, and chance encounters with guys like George Barris, the great car designer who did the Batmobile, and a lot of really interesting stories. I'm excited to get that one out. And I'm also in the early stages of working with Tracy Smothers, the man who's been fired from every promotion there is to work for. The man who's wrestled 3 bears, and I can't say it'll be the final title, but right now the working title is, if you don't read this book, everybody dies.
Well, I had the opportunity to meet and get to know Tracy several years ago, and very impressionable guy. He's like, we just met, and yet he was always interested in my opinion on things. What do you think of this or that? And so it just, we got along like best buds, and we'd only hung out together for like a half a day, but great guy.
That's Tracy. I mean, he's, he still works the independent shows. Yep. He sits behind the curtain. He watches every match. He gives everybody who will listen feedback. I worked with Badman Pondo in his book as well. Those are 2 guys. There are hundreds of men and women in the independent, not just the independents. They're working for AEW. They're working for WWE. They're working for New Japan. They owe who they are today, to Tracy saying, hey, why don't you do this a little? Hey, why don't you do that a little? And the same same with Pondo. They're two phenomenal storytellers. They're guys who have given their minds and their bodies and their souls to this business, and really with very little thanks and very little return and everything like that. It's really exciting. People seem to be really, really excited about Tracy finally putting his story into print, and I'm really, really looking forward to working with him and bringing it out.
All right. Well, John, I want to thank you very much for your time, sir, and anybody who's interested in your books, where can they find them?
They can find them on Amazon.com, where they can also find Tim's wonderful book. Or they can come to my website, eatsleepwrestle.com, to learn more about my books and also any upcoming projects I've got going on.
Great. Eat, sleep, and wrestle. All right. Well, thank you very much, John, and I look forward to seeing you a little later on this evening. Take care. All right. I am with Scott Teal with Crowbar Press. Scott, you have written or co-authored or contributed to countless books on the history of professional wrestling. You run the Crowbar Press. Tell us a little bit about the Crowbar Press and what you got going on, and what's going on, and what's going to be coming out in the near future.
Crowbar Press publishing company is a huge organization business that is actually located in about a 12 by 12 foot bedroom in my house. I've published 37 books and just came out with 4 brand new books. Got about 8-9 books in the works that'll be coming out soon. I love writing about pro wrestling and researching, because my main mission is preserving as much wrestling history as I can, especially while these guys are still alive, because we're losing so many of the legends every day. And if we don't talk to them now and give them a chance to tell their story, then all the stories, all their memories, we'll never hear them again. So that's my mission with this, and I just absolutely love what I do, and I appreciate people like Tim. He's written a book as well, and I hope he's going to write more. I've heard he said something about possibly writing another one, but I love what I do, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody here at Colorful Alley Club maybe next year in April 2020.
I appreciate that, Scott. And yeah, this year you've been appointed, what's your exact title here at Cauliflower Club now?
Executive Vice President.
Yes, sir. You're the man in charge of everything, and it's been a success so far. I know you've been running around like a chicken with your head cut off sometimes, but we're all having fun, and it's great to see you, and thanks again for all you put forth. Thank you. Take care.